Introduction to the Shadow of Divine Power. www.zhaozuiyuan.com Divine power is the power bestowed upon mortals by gods, and mortals embark on the path of divine power to seek power and status. Morin entered the city of Gondolin on a sunset, preparing to defect to his second uncle. But the eerie serial murder involved Morin, and after that, the eerie world of divine power was revealed before Morin's eyes. Discipline, Evil Desire https://www.zhaozuiyan.com. Chapter 1. A Poor Boy from the Countryside. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Name: Morin. No surname, sir. Upon hearing that there was no surname, the obese registrar in front of him looked up in surprise at the young man in front of him, but immediately continued to lower his head. Age: Sir, there are still 19 days and 19 years old left. Where do you come from? From Samaro George's collar, sir. Alright, poor boy from Samaro, welcome to Com Turin. Get your registration certificate, next one. The chubby registrar impatiently waved his hand and casually threw out a piece of paper filled with handwriting. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Morin gave a flattering little jump and grabbed his registration certificate in the air. He didn't forget to turn around and smile at the registrar before landing firmly. Even if the registrar ignored Morin. Name: George Belford. Age: The QA behind me is still ongoing, but the rest has nothing to do with me anymore. Even if the latter George Belford is a nobleman with a name and surname, while he himself is just a commoner without a surname. Morin cleared his expression and continued to walk forward, with 2 rows of huge iron trees stacked on either side of the city gate passage to resist horses. Morin looked with some awe at these iron wooden horses that were soaked in blood and appeared somewhat blackened, and walked past these old iron wooden horses with reluctance. These horses are said to have blocked the charge of the group of divine knights, but who would believe it? Morin's gaze crossed over the old and chopping iron wood that resisted the horse, and turned to the gondolin behind the city gate passage. Everyone who comes to Gondolin for the first time will be amazed by this city of white flowers, and Morin is no exception. The twilight sun slanted on the white spire, and the final glow of the sun still illuminated the emblem of the iron thorn, which is a symbol of the Gondolin royal family. The emblem of iron thorn overlooks everything in the city. Even the tower of the highest imperial institution still sits below the royal family. The sharpness of iron thorn will protect everything. This was said by Gondolin I at the grand ceremony of the completion of the palace. So the emblem of iron thorn will surely overlook everything. The white palace cast a huge shadow under the sunset, covering the Lingu Avenue behind the Thorn Bridge and the lower city area. Even Morin, who came from the countryside, learned from his storybook and bard that in the lower city area, theocrats and emperors, as well as those damn wealthy merchants, lived in the upper city district. The streets of Shangqing district are clean and tidy, with birds singing and flowers fragrant. Everyone's face is shining with happiness, just like the promised land depicted in the storybook. Worry-free, without worries. The radiance of the theocrats and empires only shines on the upper districts, and the huge shadow cast by the upper districts covers the lower districts. Even the radiance of the gods cannot break through the poverty and greed that weave darkness. Countless dark crimes nourish the lower urban area, and outsiders like Morin will be eaten and wiped clean the first time they enter the lower urban area, and their bones will not be found the next day. God brings light, but the shadows cast by it make mortals sink into it. God brings grace and blessings, but mortals hide in shadows and find it difficult to see blessings. This is a true portrayal of the downtown area. Morin carefully took out the crumpled map and a tattered letter from his arms. He crossed over half of the empire from his hometown to Gondolin to seek refuge with his distant cousin. My second uncle. Elvin Arnon left his hometown to venture into Wangdu in his early years. About half a year ago, he sent a letter back, stating that he had been doing well in Wangdu. I have already joined the Public Security Bureau, so the villagers don't have to worry about anything. So Morin left his hometown and spent half a year alone crossing half of the empire, arriving at the imperial capital. Morin grabbed the letter in his hand and hummed a song with joy. Ah, Gondolin. A huge city flowing with gold, filled with gemstones and spices. All ideals will be realized here. Morin murmured the passed-down songs, with expectations for the future in his eyes, walking step by step along the main road at the city gate towards the city. Gondolin is beautiful and wealthy. As long as we don't offend the theocrats and the royal family, life will definitely improve. But you need to find a place to live first, and staying overnight on the streets in the lower city of Gondolin is not a good idea. But before Morin could express his longing for a better life, suddenly a tremendous force pressed Morin to the ground, causing him to kneel, his hands touching the ground, as if he were a devout believer. You should bow down and meet the gods. The indifferent and emotionless voice of a woman accompanied by the wind echoed in Morin's ears. Theocrats. He is a theocrat. I, a commoner without a surname, won't be executed by the divine authorities. Morin nervously turned his head slightly and saw that everyone around him was kneeling on the ground in the same position as himself, which was when he breathed a sigh of relief. It doesn't seem to be targeting oneself, that's good. Time passed by minute by second, and the unknown theocrat lost his movement after his first move. However, the power of theocracy remained. Even though Morin's legs were numb and his eyes turned black, he could not change his posture. After about half an hour, the sound of neat and uniform footsteps began to sound as they slowly walked towards the city gate. Morin raised his head slightly, and within the limits allowed by divine authority, he was able to see what God allowed him to see. Shiny black calf leather boots, barely visible white scabbard, with green gemstones set at the end. It is the Royal Honor Guard. A dozen pairs of identical leather boots passed by in front of me, and they should be the front end of the Honor Guard. Zhaozuiyuan.com. A different pair of boots caught the eye, which was a pair of women's high boots. Fine scales were faintly visible on the high boots, and the shape of iron thorns was outlined with gold thread on the fine scales. These boots alone look unattainable. Then followed by a pair of white high heels, and the most clever craftsman wrapped a beautiful iris flower with silver thread. The iron thorns outlined by gold thread wrapped around the iris flower, and two huge pearls were also dotted on the white shoe upper. It is a royal family. Morin carefully withdrew his eyes, afraid of offending the nobles of the royal family. Then he was run over and killed on the street by the theocrats on the spot. The women's high boots seemed to be holding the hand of the person behind them, and the two pairs of shoes were walking close to each other, very close together. The high boots flashed past Morin's eyes first, followed by the white high heels. Morin's perspective could only see the lady's exquisite white high heels and pristine white soles. Under the influence of divine authority, only the hem of the black windbreaker and the white hem of the skirt can be seen. Then came the neat leather shoes of the Honor Guard. This is the second half of the Honor Guard. As the footsteps of the Honor Guard faded away, Morin felt a sudden release of pressure on his shoulders. The divine authority was lifted, but Morin knelt for too long, his legs numb, and he couldn't stand up anymore. Morin moved his stiff hands and feet, propping his hands on the ground, and barely got up from the ground. I took a deep glance at the direction of the Honor Guard's departure. For the first time, the vast imperial capital and the high authority of the gods taught a lesson to Morin, a poor boy from the Samaritan tribe. Iron thorns bless all people. Under the iron thorns, only those with divine authority and the royal family cannot be desecrated. Chapter 2. Churches and Priests. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Morin left the city gate and walked forward along Lingu Avenue, facing the setting sun, to reach the Iron Thorn Bridge. There is another inspection checkpoint on the Taijingji Bridge, as it leads to the Shangqing District and Huangqing District, so the number of people inspecting this checkpoint is very small. But the soldiers on the bridge were clearly different from those at the city gate, with their heads and chest high and strict discipline. Morin only took a deep glance at the Iron Thorn Bridge, which was not his destination for the time being. I will work hard, whether in business or politics, I will definitely enter the upper urban area openly. But now is not the time, because I don't have a surname yet. A commoner without a surname, even close to the upper city area, may be killed by guards on the spot. Being able to enter the imperial city is already a blessing from the royal family. But the lower city area is even more dangerous after nightfall, and newcomers who venture into hotels are more likely to incur misfortune. But Morin's eyes rolled and his gaze drifted towards the nearby building complex. The royal family bestowed grace, allowing the commoners to enter the imperial city. The gods have mercy on the world and are willing to take in homeless wanderers in the mortal world. Outsiders can come to the church, which will offer you a meal and overnight accommodation. This is God's teachings, this is God's grace. Morin turned his gaze to the church standing next to the Iron Thorn Bridge. This may be the only church in the downtown area. Compared to those cathedrals, this church is somewhat small, somewhat old, and even somewhat dilapidated. But the holy emblem still shines brightly, reflecting light. The holy emblem is still there, so this is the sanctuary of the God of discipline. Anselperon. A church where no one dares to offend a deity. Morin paused at the door, with a flattering smile on his face, and reached out to push open the church gate. It was already late at night, and the church had already lit 2 oil lamps. The dim light of the lamps illuminated the statue of Anselperon. The statue of Anselperon is a small old man with a big beard, leaning on a wooden cane with both hands, looking straight ahead with a serious expression. Morin carefully closed the door of the church, a small church that often only lights up the statues and lounges to save on fuel costs. Is the priest not present in this situation? Morin looked at the empty church, even though he knew that the church of the God of discipline would not have any evil intentions, but it was the first time Morin had seen such a dark and deserted church. The gloomy airflow wrapped around Morin's neck, causing him to shiver. Not quite right, not quite right. Morin slowly moved his steps and leaned back, his eyebrows furrowed, and his gaze drifting around. The queue at the city gate is so long that it is impossible for everyone to have a place to stay in the lower city area, nor is it only oneself who thinks of coming to the church for lodging. Not quite right, not quite right. Morin's hand had already touched the doorknob behind him, and the cold doorknob made Morin feel a little relieved. Just quietly open it and go out. Unfortunately, before the idea could be realized, Morin froze in place. God said, "Those who come will be guests, and I should entertain you." Morin turned his eyeballs incredulously, wishing he could turn them out and barely see the person who had been standing in the darkness of the doorpost. Now I know why there is no one coming to stay in this church. A esteemed theocrat is actually condescending to a small church in the lower city area. Morin has not yet figured out why this theocrat appeared here. The next sentence immediately followed. God said, "Come with me and enjoy good wine and delicacies." The theocrat walked out of the darkness, and it was only then that Morin could see his appearance clearly. An elderly person who looks very old, hunched and thin, with a messy beard and sunken eyes. Before he could continue to observe, the old man recited a prayer and immediately turned around, then the divine power was activated. Morin could only follow the old man uncontrollably and walked towards the restroom behind him. This is also too uncomfortable. It's like a string puppet. If I had known this way, it would have been better to sleep on a tree for a night. God said. Smile, then you can have a full meal. The old man didn't know how to speak again, and the old voice echoed in Morin's ear. The power of divine authority once again struck, causing Morin's mouth to forcefully pull out a smile, and he followed the old man through the narrow and dim corridor into the candlelit lounge. The old man took the lead in opening the stool and sat down, with a forced smile on his face. Ha! Has he also been influenced by divine power? Morin pulled a perfect smile and sat down with his body under divine control. There was only one light in the lounge, and Morin sat down to see clearly what was on the table. A pot of stewed meat, a plate of mashed potatoes, and a plate of black bread. Although black bread doesn't quite fit the identity of a theocrat, isn't there another pot of meat next to it? Morin hasn't seen meat for almost a year. Morin's hand lifted uncontrollably, reaching out to the plate of flesh in front of him. The power of divine power guided Morin to enjoy the grace from God. Humph. The old man snorted heavily, and the power on Morin's body immediately disappeared without a trace. Morin's hands stiffened in place, the power of divine authority disappeared, and the control of his body returned. But the old man in front of him stared at Morin, tearing at the black bread as if warning Morin with his eyes. Morin lowered his hand and reached out to the plate of black bread. The old man withdrew his gaze and lowered his head to insert another piece of meat into his mouth. Ouch. Grandpa, if you don't want me to eat meat, just tell me. As for using divine power to scare people. Morin was speechless, but he dared not get angry with the theocrats and could only eat silently with his head down. Morin lowered his head and bit into the black bread, occasionally pouring a spoonful of mashed potatoes into his mouth. Although it is black bread, after all, it is the black bread of the royal city. It is considered good not to have eaten sand and stones, and it is much softer than the black bread in my hometown. Have you been attacked by other theocrats today? The old man suddenly spoke, his voice a bit hoarse, but full of the dignity that belonged exclusively to the upper echelons. The old man looked at Morin, who was eating with his head down, as if satisfied that he had not eaten his own meat. His expression softened slightly, and he then opened his mouth to inquire. Morin was somewhat frightened by the old man's sudden opening and struggled to swallow the black bread in his mouth. Then he spoke with some fear, "Morin, Lord, my name is Morin." Pine. The old man slapped the table and directly interrupted Morin's unspoken words. The old man lowered his eyes, tore open the black bread in his hand and put it in his mouth, looking at Morin with a gloomy face. "Kid, don't play this game with me. When you came in, I noticed your eyes." The old man pondered for a moment, as if looking for an adjective. The indoor atmosphere froze like this, the priest remained silent, and Morin dared not speak. For a long time, the priest raised his eyes and looked into Morin's eyes. "Although you have a pleasing smile on your face, there is a glint of ambition in your eyes. People with such eyes will not be willing to look up at others." This time, the words had no divine power, but they left Morin silent for a long time. "You can call me Father Dodge. Let's just forget about the adult style. I don't like to talk like that." Father Dodge slowly took out his handkerchief and wiped the oil stains on his mouth. "I am a criminal who has been exiled from the upper city district. Let's go straight to the point at Shuyuan www.zhaoshuyuan.com, the same system as in the upper city district." Humph. Father Dodge snorted as if dissatisfied and then stopped talking. Morin had been brewing for a long time, looking at Father Dodge in front of him and struggling to speak. "At sunset today, a female voice rang in my ear from a distance, and then I knelt down. Bow your head and meet the gods." The lady's indifferent voice seemed to ring in her ear once again, and Morin's knees softened, as if she wanted to kneel down again. "Don't kneel. All right, there's no need to say, I already know who it is." The old man seemed to have anticipated and raised his hand to interrupt Morin's words. Then he covered his face with his wrinkled hands. How could she be like this? How could she be? Father Dodge murmured to himself, full of regret. Morin looked at the old theocrat in front of him, unsure of what to do. "Sorry, I made you laugh." Father Dodge quickly sorted out his emotions and pointed to the small room behind him. "Go rest, the bed for the believers is right behind." Morin nodded and got up to rest. "Kid," just as Morin walked to the door of the room, Father Dodge spoke again. Morin wisely stopped in place, waiting for Father Dodge's words. Father Dodge remained silent for even longer this time, until Morin doubted whether he should wait any longer. The core of the divine right of precepts is not oppression of the people, but self-restraint. After Dodge finished speaking these endless words, he picked up the knives and forks on the table, and Morin knew he shouldn't continue standing here, so he turned around and entered the small room. Chapter 3. Madman. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Lying on the wooden bed, Morin looked at the pitch-black ceiling. The wooden boards under him were very hard, and the quilt on his body had a musty smell. However, none of these could calm Morin's mood, and his heart couldn't calm down for a long time. Discipline in divine authority. Originally, there were different classifications of theocrats. Was it precepts that made them kneel before? Who was that team of people before? Those two pairs of shoes are quite nice. What is the relationship between Father Dodge and that female theocrat? Constrain oneself. What does Father Dodge mean by his last words? The thoughts in his mind were unbearable, but he had to wake up early tomorrow morning to find his second uncle. Morin could only suppress the surging thoughts in his mind and turn over to sleep. A long night. The morning sun passed through the small window and crashed into this dim little room, dispelling the long darkness. It also made Morin open his eyes. A new day has arrived, the divine gifts have come to an end, and I cannot continue to stay in the church. Sleeping well, Morin stretched lazily, and the aroma of creamy stewed vegetables was already emanating from his nose. It seems that Father Dodge is still very diligent. Morin tidied up a little and came out to see Father Dodge already sitting on the table, with a set of utensils placed in the empty space next to him. On the table are black bread and a pot of cream-stewed vegetables. The priest is truly a priest, even in the lower city area, he lives such a nourishing life. Last night was meat, and in the morning there was cream stew. Morin walked up to the tableware on the table, pulled out the stool, and sat down. Father Dodge remained serious, with no other expression on his face, making it difficult to tell what he was thinking. Kid, last night's meal was a gift promised by the gods, and I invited you to this meal. Father Dodge looked at Morin sitting across from him and spoke. So there's no need to smile or show respect to the gods, you deserve this meal. Morin's mouth twitched, and if the deity invited him, he would use divine power. The feeling of being manipulated was very uncomfortable, right? Father Dodge scooped up a spoonful of cream stew and poured it onto the black bread, allowing the soup to saturate the bread as much as possible. Although I know that people like you can do well even in the chaotic downtown area, I still want to know your plans for the future. Morin was busy enjoying the hard-earned cream stew when he heard it and looked up at Father Dodge. Father Dodge's usual serious expression makes it difficult to see through his thoughts. However, Morin took out the wrinkled letter from his close pocket and handed it to Father Dodge. Father Dodge took the letter from home and carefully read it. Morin secretly lifted his head and looked at Father Dodge with the remaining light. I have read the letter from home countless times, but the content is very limited. It is probably because I am doing well and there is no need to worry about it at home. It also includes my work address. But Father Dodge watched slowly and his expression became increasingly rich. Father Dodge furrowed his brows tightly as he looked back, but in the end, he suddenly relaxed. Father Dodge pressed the letter on the table and said to Morin, "Are you planning to go to the security bureau in the downtown area as stated in this letter?" Father Dodge seemed to have thought of something happy, with a hint of a smile on his lips. "I definitely have to go. I'm a poor kid with no background, and I don't have any money anymore. If I don't find a job, I'll have to go beg for food." Morin rolled his eyes at the words, then swallowed the black bread in his mouth and showed a kind smile. "Or do you have any background that can help me find a job that suits my heart?" Father Dodge handed back the family letter and poured a spoonful of cream-stewed vegetables on black bread. "As an exiled theocrat, treating you to a meal in this church is already the limit. I don't have the authority to add someone to the church's roster, but I can give you some advice." "No, perhaps the suggestion sounds a bit better." Father Dodge gestured at the old letter with his eyes and said casually. That letter from home has expired. It was like saying a joke, without further ado. Expired. What does Mao mean? Is there any mention of expiration for this thing? Due to certain rules, I can't reveal more to you. Just take it as a command from a disliked big shot. Father Dodge wiped his mouth, pointed to the sunlit door, and issued an eviction order. All right, Mr. Morin from Samuro George, it's time for you to embrace your new life. Morin also swallowed what was in his mouth, patted the dust off his body, and walked towards the door. There should have been a bundle originally, but I didn't know where to throw it away before entering the city. Now I only have this outfit on me. Okay, it's easy and comfortable to enjoy. Wait, Mr. Morin. Before Morin left, Father Dodge spoke again. Morin stopped in front of the door, one hand already resting on the doorknob. The sunlight shone through the crack in the door, cutting through the junction of light and darkness. Morin is still one last step away from his brand new life. Morin stopped in place, waiting for Father Dodge's message. Have you ever killed anyone? The atmosphere solidified, and Morin placed his hand on the doorknob. For a moment, he didn't know why Dodge wanted to ask this question. Or rather, I don't know how to answer. No, how could I kill someone? How could I do such a thing? How could I? Morin hesitated for a long time, looking for Shuyuan. www.zhaoshuyuan.com seemed like answering Dodge's question, or as if talking to himself. Without looking back at Father Dodge's face, he muttered and turned the door open on his own before leaving. Father Dodge, who was left behind, sat alone in the dim lounge. Father Dodge kept looking at the door through which Morin went out, and after a long time, he stood up and opened all the doors and windows, allowing sunlight to enter this dilapidated church to the fullest. It seems like wanting the sunlight to dispel something unknown. Then he knelt in front of the statue of Encepharon, stretched out his hands, and prayed devoutly to the statue in the sunlight. God, I have spared a madman today, and I pray for your forgiveness of my sins. Father Dodge clasped his hands together and worshipped devoutly. From the moment he entered the church, I should have killed him, but I didn't. A person who traveled through half of the empire, without companions or surnames, arrived safely at the royal city. I have released a madman, so I hereby request forgiveness. Father Dodge stood up from the ground, closed the doors and windows again, and plunged the church back into darkness. Only the statue of Ansel Perron was left bathed in the sunlight, appearing solemn and solemn. Father Dodge knelt in the darkness, opened his hands to the statue in the light, and shouted loudly. I have betrayed my Lord's creed, just to watch the joke of fate. I dwell in sin and mud, only because fate never shows mercy. Fate mocks our lives, but I enjoy it so much. Old friend, I don't have much time left. You need to hurry. The door was tightly closed, leaving only Father Dodge's murmurs lingering in it. Chapter 4. Deception. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Morin walked quickly out of the dimly lit church and into the sunlight, walking towards the depths of the lower city. His footsteps were hurried, as if he was avoiding something, but behind him there was nothing but light. The church is on Lingu Avenue, while Morin's destination is in the adjacent Koseg district. Koseg district is one of the few relatively clean areas in the lower urban area, as the security bureau of the lower urban area is established here. Lingu Avenue is directly connected to the Iron Thorn Bridge and the city gate, which can be considered as the exposed face of the upper city area. Therefore, there are people patrolling and cleaning regularly every day to avoid appearing dirty and chaotic. And the gangs in the lower urban area are also well aware that no one dares to reach out to Lingu Avenue. And the same applies to the Koseg district, as the security bureau in the lower city area is established here. Leaving Lingu Avenue, Morin broke into the Koseg district. Did you just come in on the 75th? That saved me a lot of effort. In front of me is a daily necessities store, with some blackened oak signs indicating its location with numbers. Morin recognized the direction and slowly walked inward. But as we walked, the streets became narrower and smaller, and the shops on the street became even more bloated. Dirty slate and dilapidated signs formed an increasingly swollen street. Like one giant beast after another devouring a few streets. The storefront of the street has become increasingly dirty, so dirty that even the doorplate cannot be recognized. Let me see, 152, 153, 155. Morin struggled to recognize the numbers on it, occasionally pulling out letters to take a look. Morin looked up and counted the number on it. The address of the security bureau written on Uncle Ayre's letter was 154 in the Koseg district. But Morin stood in front of 155th, an old tailor shop with a dusty entrance that seemed to have not been open for business for a long time. Even with discounted numbers written on it. The next door is 153, but only 154 is missing. Not far away, it was almost approaching the city wall, and Morin had no way to go. It's strange, what about 154? Morin scratched his head, feeling a bit confused. Hey, big brother, is number 154 here? Morin casually stopped a pedestrian and pointed to the door number above, asking. Stupid, it burned to ashes half a year ago on the 154th. Now I'm having a brain problem looking for it. The man who was stopped showed displeasure and cursed Morin a few words. He shook Morin's hand and continued walking forward. Ha! Morin looked at the pitch-black open space next to 155th and thought it was a fork in the road, but it turned out to be a pile of ashes. Morin smacked his lips, suppressing the urge to go back to the church and ask Father Dodge a clear question, and turned his gaze to the old lady who was setting up a street stall at the fork in the road ahead. This type of street vendor is very common in the lower urban area. They place anything on their stall and sell everything, but they can't sell anything. They may be employed by a mafia, or by a big shot, or of course, they may be sitting outside without a moment's rest. Auntie, where is the police station heading? The old woman lifted her head and glanced at Morin. Her head was wrapped in a black headscarf, covering her thinning hair. The fabric was no longer visible in color, but it was still tied to her head. The wrinkles on his face are deep, and he looks very old. His blue eyes are already chaotic. With lifeless eyes, it looks like waiting to die on the roadside. On the booth in front of me, there was just a pile of black paint, I don't know what it was. Hee, is this gentleman here to have fun? The old woman just glanced at Morin and continued to bury her head in her knee. I'm a stranger, respected lady. I just arrived in Gondolin. But the old woman ignored him and still buried her head under her knees. Oh my goodness, old man. I'm really new here. I stayed overnight at the church last night, and if I can't find the police station, I'll have to sleep on the street. Morin's face was filled with kind smiles, hoping to impress the old woman in front of her with her brilliant smile. Church. Did you spend the night in the church last night? The old woman lifted her head and looked at the young man in front of her with murky eyes, seeming somewhat incredulous. That's right, that priest in the church looks quite fierce at people, but he's actually very kind to me. Seeing the old woman in front of her react, Morin quickly added fuel and vinegar to the conversation. Father Dodge actually really appreciates me. He even treated me to breakfast. Woo! The old woman quickly lifted her hand and blocked Morin's mouth, allowing his remaining words to be swallowed back into her stomach. Alright, stinky kid, don't mention that name anywhere else, you'll be unlucky if someone hears it. Morin quickly nodded, and then the old woman withdrew her hand. Those turbid blue eyes looked up and down at Morin, as if looking at some peerless treasure. The exploratory gaze made Morin feel a bit creepy. It's really rare that you didn't get thrown out and hung on the pillar that night by that guy, blowing the cold wind bestowed by the gods, and spending the night on the pillar. Well, I'm really lucky. Morin's mind is full of black lines, no wonder no one goes to the church to stay overnight. Father Emotional Dodge has such a bad temper. The old woman lowered her head back and spoke in a muffled voice. Young man, how could the Public Security Bureau rank here? The things under the jurisdiction of the royal family are either number 1 or number 2. How could they rank up to over 150-inch? This place is already close to the city wall, and not far ahead is the place where those guys in the ditch bury their bodies. How could the adults of the Security Bureau be here? Do you still need me to remind you of this common sense thing, old lady? The old woman's words echoed like a thunderbolt in Morin's heart. Morin frowned and took out the letter from his pocket. Quickly opening, my eyes were scanning rapidly on it, but in vain. Because it still says 154 Koseg District, instead of the called Koseg District 1 or 2. What are you doing here? No, why are you here? It seems like Uncle Air asked me to come over and join him. The old woman tugged at the letter in Morin's hand and forcefully tore off a corner of the letter. Don't look, for the sake of that old guy's face, I'll help you once. Before Morin could speak, the old woman stared at her murky eyes and asked Morin to shut up. Immediately after, the old woman grabbed a corner of the letter and tore it into pieces. She threw the letter back to Morin, then took out a pack of matches from her arms and scraped them against the wall. The matches quickly burst into a bright light. Then the old woman sprinkled the debris onto the flame, which rose into the air and emitted an ominous purple smoke. Zhaoshuyuan.com. What is this? Morin frowned and looked at the scene in front of him. Without anyone saying, Morin also realized something was wrong with the letter. Just some expired little tricks. The old woman wiped the dust off her hand and pointed to the number 154 that had been burned to ashes. About half a year ago, someone bought the 154th item, which appeared to be in the fabric business but was actually selling people. They extensively forged directories and names, and later sent out such letters, which were infused with the purple dust known as chaotic hearts. The person who receives the letter will be disturbed every time they flip through the letter, and over time, they will subconsciously follow the address on the letter, come here, and then be pulled closer to the store, disappearing. But this medication is afraid of high temperatures, so there's no need to worry about the letters of important people because they need to be sealed with fire paint. The old woman tidied up the things on the stall and glanced sideways at Morin. Unfortunately, they went too far. They did something they shouldn't have done 6 months ago and were set on fire. Without giving Morin time to react, the old woman continued to speak. However, this thing can only be used for letters. It is usually used to deceive people in the villages around Wandu. It is the first time I have seen you, a stranger who has been deceived. The old woman packed the package, carried it on her body, hunched her back, and prepared to leave. Think about it carefully. This trick expired 6 months ago. Who is the person who sent the letter to you? You should know that sending a letter is a very expensive thing. Sending a letter to you might even buy 10 of you in the slave market. The old woman walked away step by step with her backpack on her back, leaving only Morin standing there staring blankly at the pile of ashes. Chapter 5. Wal Dong. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Really? It's over now. Morin squatted alone on the roadside, poking the corner of the wall in front of him with the branches of his hand. Damn Elvin Arnon, this second uncle he has never met before. If he didn't make a name for himself in Wandu. Why did you cross over half of the empire and join him here? I can't even remember now, who gave me this family letter and urged me to come to the capital. I don't remember what happened 6 months ago. Why are you so obsessed with the sun that you came to the capital? Can Wandu ask for more food than at home? Morin lifted his head and looked at his original goal across from him. Number 1 Kasage District, the headquarters of the Lower City Public Security Bureau. Compared to the low building next to it, the Public Security Bureau appears grand and majestic, with an area more than 3 times larger than the second shop next to it. The 2 security officers standing guard at the entrance have been watching Morin for a long time. After all, a fool poking a branch at the entrance of the security bureau for almost a morning is also a rare pleasure. At this moment, the sun had already risen 3 times, hitting the white marble at the entrance of the security bureau, reflecting a dazzling light, but unable to illuminate Morin's dark future. According to the family letter, I should have recognized my second uncle, then joined the public security bureau, and then made a fortune. But now it's all gone. Morin didn't know what he was doing at the police station, perhaps because he was unwilling to leave the capital in such a disheveled state. No way. Morin seemed to have made up some kind of determination, throwing away the tattered branches that had already been poked in his hand, and walking towards the gate of the security bureau. Stop. What are you doing here? The 2 sheriffs shouted loudly, while reaching out their hand to stop Morin, who was about to enter. The other hand lit up the sword and security stick on their waist. Sir, I'm here to find someone. My second uncle asked me to come here to find him. Morin's face was full of smiles, as he took the hand of the sheriff and squeezed his body to squeeze inside. Looking for someone. Find someone and stand at the door for a whole morning. Get out first. 2 sheriffs grabbed Morin and together they threw him back outside. Morin was thrown out and fell off his butt in pain, rubbing his own butt in pain. Quickly stood up, with a smile on his face, and continued to stick it on. Morin skillfully pulled out the letter that had been torn apart by the old woman, then leaned forward again and handed it over, laughing and explaining. No, my lord. I didn't dare to come in at once because of the grandeur here. Look up, my second uncle, Elvin Arnon, said he asked me to come to the police station to find him. Whoever you are, go out first. A sheriff had lost patience and took out an oak stick from his waist, ready to give Morin a good look. Wait, do you think this name sounds familiar to you? Another sheriff grabbed his colleague and whispered in his ear. Alvin Arnon. This name. This unfamiliar yet familiar name entered the minds of the 2 security officers, causing them to ponder carefully. They seemed to have remembered something, looking at each other and not continuing to obstruct Morin. The impatience on the faces of the 2 disappeared, and a smile appeared on their faces, as if they had encountered some great good thing. Come with me. One sheriff returned to his post, while another sheriff waved his hand, gesturing for Morin to follow behind him. Is there really a play? Originally, Morin had already given up hope for this second uncle. After all, the family letter had been exposed by the old woman. It's just that someone forged the name of Uncle Air and sent it to their family. However, Uncle Air really exists and has indeed left his hometown to venture into the capital. As long as he comes here to cause trouble, anyone who cares about his life or death can provide himself with 2 meals. Morin was overjoyed in his heart. He had just wanted to fish in troubled waters and make a scene. It was best to keep him locked up for 2 or 3 days so that he could settle down easily. Report the case to the Public Security Bureau and have Uncle come to find him. Whoever sent that letter, take care of yourself first. If Uncle Air really made a name for himself, then I will follow Uncle Air. If Uncle Air doesn't know where he went, then he'll just hang out at the Public Security Bureau for a while. A smile couldn't help but appear on the corner of his mouth, and he followed the sheriff in front of him into the deepest office. Report, sir. The person you are waiting for has arrived. The sheriff saluted outside the door, knocked on the door, and shouted loudly. Wait. Who is waiting for me? A hint of unease surged in Morin's heart, and he suppressed his urge to turn around and sneak away. Go in, then get out of here. A lively female voice emanated from it, and the sheriff quickly opened the door through a crack, then slipped away, leaving only Morin, who was lost in place. In. Do you want me to go out and invite you? Morin swallowed his saliva, with a smile on his face, and walked lightly into the office. Sir, I'll come in. Morin humbly closed the door, his tone full of flattery. But before the words could be spoken, the Shuyuan website www.zhaoshuyuan.com was sealed in his mouth. Morin opened his eyes wide and his pupils quickly narrowed. A military knife spun rapidly in front of Morin, rubbing against his face and slashing at the door. Morin stood stiffly in place, turning his head in disbelief to look at the military knife that had wiped Cheng Liang, and swallowed a mouthful of saliva with difficulty. Pang! With one hand vigorously tapping on the other side of Morin, Morin's soul was brought back. As soon as Morin regained his senses, he saw a pretty face slowly approaching him, with sea-blue pupils, golden hair, fair and delicate skin, but a small scar on his right eye. But it doesn't affect the girl in front of her, and even adds a touch of heroism to her. The girl is half a head lower than Morin, but she still belongs to that tall figure. The black uniform of the sheriff is cut and fitted, and the black leather belt is tied tightly, outlining the beautiful figure of the girl. If it were on a regular basis, Morin would definitely make a big comment in his heart. But now the other hand held a military knife and slowly approached Morin. The last two people only stayed at a finger's distance, and Morin could smell the faint fragrance on the girl in front of him. But Morin had no interest in continuing the ambiguous atmosphere in front of him, only thinking of finding a way to get rid of the girl in front of him. At first glance, this woman is the kind of person with explosive strength, okay. What to do? What to do? Morin's brain was running rapidly, wanting to free himself from this oppressive atmosphere. But before he could come up with a solution, he heard the girl in front of him shout loudly. Speak up. Why did you kill Elvin Arnon? Ah. Morin's thinking stopped. Chapter 6. Trial. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Name. Huaisher. M.O. Morin, I don't have a surname, sir. Why did you kill Elvin Arnon? Even in the interrogation room, which was still dimly lit during the day, the girl's voice remained unusually loud. The girl with sea-blue eyes patted the table, ignoring that Morin was a commoner without a surname, and shouted fiercely at Morin. I'm wrongly accused. Sir, I only arrived in the capital yesterday. Morin cried with a face full of grievances towards the girl in front of her, lifting her hand to wipe away the tears on her face. Look, this is the permit issued to me yesterday. I only arrived at the royal city yesterday. Morin seemed to remember something and quickly took out the entry permit issued by the sheriff from his pocket. The girl took the permit from Morin's hand, and after seeing the date clearly, a hint of embarrassment flashed in her eyes, but she immediately regained her composure. Still arguing, why are you looking for the deceased? You're still picking today. Today. Is there anything special today? A hint of doubt flashed through Morin's heart, but he still answered the question honestly. Because I entered the city too late yesterday and was delayed at the city gate for a while, I stayed overnight at the church and went to find my second uncle the next day. Actually, it was all because of that inexplicable female theocrat who made Morin kneel at the city gate for over half an hour. At the city gate. Oh, I see. You're really unlucky to have met your older sister. The girl slapped the table without any image and laughed heartily, but immediately turned into a decadent state. So it seems it's really not you anymore. That old man lied to me again. Time is coming, woo-woo. The girl lay on the table without any image, switching from a smile to sadness without hesitation. You have a problem with your brain. Morin looked at the girl rolling in front of him with a black line in his mind. Sir, why did you say you were waiting for me? Morin raised his hand to interrupt the girl's despair and raised a question. You're talking about this. There's an old man in Shangqing district who is said to have a very effective prophecy. I've been pestering him for a long time and he gave me a prophecy. The girl propped herself on the table with one hand, while her other hand played with her hair hanging in her ear. The person who came to the police station today and said they wanted to find Elvin Arnon was the key figure, as the gods chattered on. The girl glanced sideways at Morin and let out a deep sigh. Hey, I'll figure it out on my own. Morin's eyes twitched and he had a plan in mind. Sir, you don't know anything. Before she could finish speaking, she was interrupted by the girl raising her hand. Don't call me Lord, my name is Heller Silva. You can call me Captain Heller, or Director Heller. It's strange to be called Lord by someone older than you. Molin's mouth twitched as he couldn't understand what Wang Du and his group were up to. The old man in the church was fine, and this young girl didn't want to follow this trick. But the director Morin looked at the young girl in front of him, who was obviously not very old, and felt even more that these big shots were unreliable. Is this an important position just handed over to a little girl? Captain Heller, I think this prophecy makes sense. Morin's face changed and he whispered to Heller. Oh, are you finally going to admit that you killed it? Admit it quickly so that I can take you to chop your head. Heller sat up straight with excitement, looking at Morin with an expectant expression on his face. Cut you off and close the case, so I can go back to the upper city to report. No, I think I definitely have an important role, it's just that I haven't discovered it yet. Morin's face changed and he solemnly said to Heller. Why don't you leave me in the security bureau first, Captain Heller? You can assign me any position to do it, and it's also within your surveillance range. Morin fully revealed his plans. It is both a conspiracy and a conspiracy. If Heller believed in the prophecy to be effective, then Morin must be left behind. Compared to staying in prison, Morin prefers to be more proactive. So Morin has already successfully settled in Wangdu. Haile Silva did not reply to Morin, just looked directly at him. There was no other emotion mixed in those sea blue pupils, just looking at him. Morin felt a bit guilty after seeing it, lowered his head, and dared not look at those beautiful eyes again. Sure, you kid, dare you plan on me? Heller's indifferent voice came, and Morin dared not look at her face. He only dared to sneak a glance with his spare light. Heller held his hands on his chest and tapped the table with his fingers. Immediately after, a tense atmosphere enveloped Morin, pressing him inch by inch, making him almost breathless. Morin looked up in terror, wanting to say something to Heller, but he met the crimson pupils. It's like a ruby, but it's as if blood is surging inside. Despair, terror, anger, regret, countless negative emotions surged into Morin's heart, stirring his nerves. Kill her. Kill her. Break her hands and feet, crush her bones. Let her kneel on the ground and torture her by all means. Countless voices were shouting in Morin's ear, driving Morin to extend his right hand. Under the cold gaze of Heller Silva, he gradually reached out to her. And she just looked, with those blood-like eyes. It seems to carry a hint of anticipation. No way. Never touch her. Intuition tells Morin that if he touches Heller's body, something terrifying will definitely happen. Pop. A crisp sound sounded. Hale's eyes flashed with a hint of amazement. Morin's right hand fiercely slapped his face, sweeping away all his thoughts. As if it wasn't enough, he slapped himself hard several times. The tremendous force left blood-red marks on his face, and Mo Lin, who was fanned, was full of meat and vegetables, spinning around in circles. Morin, who had been reborn from the disaster, sat paralyzed in a chair, his head drooping weakly, panting heavily. Heller stood up, the heel of his leather boots tapping against the brick and stone floor, making rhythmic clicking sounds. Approaching, approaching. The sound stopped, and Morin only saw a pair of leather boots parked in front of him. I can only see the upper and collar, it feels so familiar. It's like that evening yesterday. Morin's mind unconsciously recalled the leather boots that had passed in front of him, they were so luxurious, indicating the prosperity of Gondolin. But those prosperity have nothing to do with oneself. Morin shook his head, wanting to lift it up and look at her, as an ordinary person, to see her. To gain one's own dignity. But Morin no longer had the strength to look up at her. An indescribable sense of guilt filled his limbs, as if he had his own consciousness all over his body, resisting Morin's control. At this moment, Morin had no strength at all. Two cold fingers touched Morin's chin and gently lifted his head. Morin lifted his head and was forced to look at Heller, who was leaning his face up. She leaned her face very close, and Morin could even see the fine fuzz on her face. In the dimly lit room, even the dim light couldn't cover Hale's beautiful features and fair and delicate skin. I also saw the crimson that had not yet dispersed from her. Scarlet still enveloped her right eye, and her left eye had returned to its previous sea blue color. One blue and one red, appearing both enchanting and holy. This is a lesson, from Mr. Morin led by Samuro George. Haile Silva solemnly called out Morin's name and stared at him with straight eyes, speaking softly. Don't try to force me to agree to something, and don't try to use your intelligence to trick me. Fingers gently moved upwards, and the cold fingers covered Morin's cheek, supporting Morin with the flow. I'm stupid, I don't have the intelligence and intelligence of my older sister, but that doesn't mean you can calculate on me. The unknown coldness covered his face, fading away the marks of Morin hitting himself. I am a noble theocrat, the second daughter of the Silva family, and the director of the Lower City Security Bureau. Do you understand? Mr. Morin, don't try to plot against me, plot against someone born noble. The deep voice receded, the fingers withdrew, and Morin's head once again lowered weakly. Miso. The sound of swords unsheathing. Molen Mao exerted all his strength and raised his head slightly to watch Heller's movements. She pulled out the military knife that almost killed Morin before and slowly walked towards Morin. Done. Has my life come to an end here? The cold blade lay flat on Morin's shoulder, but it did not cut Morin's head forward. Zhaoshuyuan.com Morin from Samuro George's leadership, you will join me today to share our glory and protect the safety of our people. Heller's solemn voice echoed in Morin's ear. Morin hasn't reacted yet. The blade left Morin's shoulder and was sheathed. Heller turned around and left, stopping at the door. Turn your head slightly. Mr. Morin, welcome to join the Public Security Bureau. Then the door closed and there was no further sound. Morin sat motionless on the chair, and for a while, an ugly smile appeared on his face. On the second day of arriving at the capital, Morin took his most important step. Even if we lose our dignity, even if you keep a low voice, even if it means laughing and pleasing, but he got his chance. On the other side, Heller quickly returned to his office, eagerly opened a drawer, and took out a piece of parchment from inside. Oh, let me see, let me see. Heller quickly scanned the text above, then found a certain item and marked it with a feather pen in his mouth. Give the person who came to find Evan Arnon today a warning and coerce him into joining the police station, complete. Heller proudly lifted his foot on the desk, without any image of a lady. It's just that kid voluntarily wanted to join, shouldn't it be okay? Xia Mawe didn't break his bones, shouldn't it be okay? Heller happily threw the parchment back into the drawer and excitedly turned it around twice. I've finally finished all the steps of the old man's prophecy. We'll just wait to solve the case. Chapter 7. Senior Leads Newcomers. You are listening at novelfull.audio. John. If you're not dead, come out quickly. The director is here. Heller, without any image of a lady, shouted and shouted at the office door, calling out someone's name through the wooden door. Hey, sir, Captain Heller, I'm here. A man's voice came out of the office, and then a thin man walked out. This man is very thin, with cheekbones on his face, emerald green eyes, and golden hair. He looks quite handsome. Well, John, I have found the partner you applied for. Take him to complete the onboarding procedures. All right, that's it. I'll go back first. Heller unconsciously threw the problem to his subordinates, then waved his hand, shook his hair, and returned to his office. It was obvious that John was already familiar with this kind of Heller and waved his hand towards Heller as he walked away. Take your time, Director Heller. Then his gaze turned towards Morin, who was standing on the side at a loss. All right, that's your question now. Come with me first. The man named John by Heller smiled and gestured to the office behind the door. My name is John Smith, and I am your future partner. Morin followed the man and walked into this office. The office is not big, with a coat rack behind the door, a wardrobe on the right side, and 2 desks by the window. One desk is empty, scattered with several stacks of information, while the other desk is filled with information. The entire office is in such a clear view. John walked up to the empty desk and began packing up the scattered paper materials. Sorry, this desk has been empty, so I piled up some materials. Morin looked at the office and quickly stepped forward to help John tidy it up. Here, this is the onboarding application. Please fill it out and give me these things. Morin took the paper with both hands and sat on an empty table beside him, filling it out. There is nothing very important above, just some names, birthplaces, addresses, and so on. Of course, Morin set an example and without hesitation, filled in the address with the police station. Alright, Senior John, I've finished filling it out. John took the paper and looked at Morin. Look at you calling me Senior, let me teach you the first lesson, newcomer. John crumpled the application form in his hand, then tore it into pieces and threw it out the window. No one will care about this thing. John shrugged and looked at Morin with a smile on his face, extending a finger to the ceiling. Those who can work here either have outstanding abilities or possess this. John looked at Morin with a smile, his fingers still holding the position of pointing to the ceiling. Morin clearly understood what he was saying. Of course, I believe most of my colleagues have both. John looked straight at Morin, but there was no surprise on his face. It seems as if it was already expected, there was nothing unexpected. Just kidding, if you're familiar with the boss and buy a dish, you can cut in line. Can the Public Security Bureau be some pristine place? Oh, it's boring, Iris. You won. I'll treat you to dinner, John shouted in disappointment towards the wardrobe, and a bad feeling surged into Morin's heart. I just said that the director personally brought it over. How could he be scared by such a thing and make a profit? The door of the wardrobe was kicked open, and a petite girl emerged from the empty wardrobe. Judging from his height, he is probably only below Morin's shoulder, flat in the front and flat in the back. His hair is light golden like John's, but his voice is full of vitality. The girl smiled happily at this moment, her eyes narrowed and looked like crescent moon. Hello, my name is Iris. Iris Johnson, the Shadow God, is your partner's cousin. Iris smiled and extended a finger to John, who was not looking well next to her, then extended her right hand and shook hands with Morin. Really, won't we just lose to you for dinner? Why are you so proud? John scratched his head and extended his right hand, shaking hands with Morin as well. Let me formally introduce you, John Smith, the Lord of Discipline, as your partner. Morin looked at the 2 people in front of him and then introduced them with a certain expression. Morin, from Samuro George's collar, not a theocrat. The smiles on the faces of the 2 people in front suddenly froze, revealing an incredible expression. Are you not from the upper echelons? How did you persuade the director to let you join our special operations team? Didn't you touch the director's hem and get your arm broken? John and Alice's questions were raised one after another, and they asked completely different questions, but both of them had a sky-shattering expression. I always feel like you 2 are thinking about something very impolite. Morin looked at his cousin in front of him and didn't know what to say. Did someone interrupt you because of Heller's incident? Morin asked the lively Iris. Yeah, that's the director's divine power ability, targeting someone who started thinking about divine power interrogation. If you have malicious thoughts about it, you will be provoked and do some very bad things. Iris pointed her finger to her chin, recalling the scene at that time. As soon as the director took office, he summoned all the key members for a meeting, and then the 2 undercover agents bumped into the director's clothes and were interrupted and thrown out. Only those with evil desires in their hearts will be provoked, and once provoked, it is not so easy to solve. But who would have no evil desires? Only the theocrats can forcibly suppress them by themselves. Really, what was Heller asking at that time? Did I calculate on her? No wonder Heller was so surprised at that time. She couldn't figure out why she wasn't a theocrat but could suppress her reaction when looking for Shuyuan www.zhaoshuyuan.com. Morin had an answer in his heart and then turned his head to look at John. Is it strange that all the people in the security bureau are from the upper district? Isn't it strange that I'm from the upper district? John immediately understood that Morin was really an outsider. Well, since you just came in, I told you that due to certain special reasons, people in the lower urban area cannot hold positions in the Public Security Bureau, let alone outsiders. Therefore, the positions in the Public Security Bureau in the lower urban area are selected by people from the upper district, and all of our special action teams are theocrats, without exception. John said a lot in one breath, then looked at Morin in front of him with a smile on his lips. So, you may be the only non-upper-level district employee who has been employed by the Public Security Bureau in the past 20 years, Morin casually shook off his hand. Anyway, he has already joined the company, so let's have lunch first. And if you're not a theocrat, why did the director arrange for you to come to us? All of us in this group are theocrats. John looked thoughtfully at Morin, who had an ordinary appearance, unsure of what he was thinking. Oh, cousin, don't think about it. Let's go and have lunch first. Iris pushed and shoved the two people towards the door. Ding-ling-ling. But the sudden piercing bell interrupted several people's movements. Urgent meeting. You can come too, Morin. Let's talk about uniforms or something later. John distinguished the meaning of the bell, raised his eyebrows, and quickly walked out of the office. Iris followed closely behind, and Morin followed the two in confusion. Chapter 8. New Dead. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Morin, please stand behind me. It's customary for our security department to have meetings. John raised his arm and gestured behind his seat. Morin followed John and entered the conference room, which was designed in a round table style. There are only 4 chairs in total, occupying less than half of this conference room. John sat on the last chair, and Morin quickly stood behind him. Iris was standing behind John's left seat, grinning at Morin. Sitting in front of Iris was a serious middle-aged man with a tough face, light purple pupils, and hair on both sides beginning to turn white. What caught Morin's attention the most was the sturdy muscles on this middle-aged man's body. My muscles have become sperm. Morin looked in awe at the man's well-developed chest muscles and thick arms. Oh, it's all here. There's a newcomer. Where's our dear Director Heller? A frivolous voice came from the door, and a well-dressed man walked into the conference room, followed by a dignified lady. He smiled and gestured towards Morin, who quickly nodded. It may not be appropriate to be flashy, but this is really the adjective that Morin was able to come up with at the first time. 8 out of 10 fingers were adorned with colorful rings, and 5 or 6 chains were also worn on both wrists. Make a collision sound as you walk. I don't know why a green feather has been inserted into my gray hair. I also wore 3 different colored chains around my neck. On the serious uniform of the Public Security Bureau, he fastened a dozen colorful ornaments with a safety pin. Is this person lacking ornaments in their life? Dear Miss Vanessa, where is our dear director? The man dressed in colorful clothes pulled open the chair and sat on it casually, placing his feet on the table. Start playing with the chain on the left hand with your right hand. Dear Deputy Director Michael, may I remind you again? Please maintain your posture during the meeting. The woman standing behind him spoke up and reminded him to distribute the materials in her hand. The lady wore a very strict uniform, wore a meticulous tie, and had neat hair. The whole person revealed 2 words. Serious. Okay, really. Michael withdrew his feet from the table and sat a little straight before picking up the materials and starting to read them. Vanessa distributed the materials and paused for a moment when sending them to Morin, but still sent out the materials. Next time, newcomers need to report to me first. Your information is for my backup. Morin received the information and smiled apologetically at Vanessa. Ladies and gentlemen, new victims have appeared in the lower urban area, using the same techniques as before. Before the director arrives, please take a look at the information. The emergency meeting was initiated by me with the authority of Deputy Director Michael, and I have filed the record of the application. After sending the materials, Vanessa stood back behind Michael, standing straight and meticulous. George Belford. Why is this name so familiar? Morin looked at the name above, scratched his head, and then looked at the specific information below. What was the entry time into the city? Yesterday. Morin slapped his head and said, wasn't this Big Brother who followed him into the city yesterday? Those who haven't arrived yet should continue reading. Heller ran in with great enthusiasm. I'm here, what's going on? What's going on? Where's the information? Heller rushed in, but before he could stand firm, he threw himself into his seat. The wooden chair made a loud creaking sound from the impact, but it still did not affect Heller's amazing body balance ability. She turned herself around in the seat, grabbed the information, and then lay on the table. By the way, Director, here is a letter from Shangqing District, which is sent to you. Miss Vanessa drew a letter from the pile of documents she was holding on her chest and handed it to Heller. There is no sender or mailing address on the letter, but there is a white gold lacquered seal on it, surrounded by a cluster of iron thorns. It's a letter from the royal family. Heller didn't care at all and pulled open the lacquer. Mao impatiently took out the letters inside and quickly scanned them. John, why don't you take Morin to see the body first? The body should have been transported to the ground, but I estimate it should have already been processed by those corpse collectors. Heller looked at the information in his hand and gave orders to John. Ah. Director, are you bringing him with you? John has some doubts. It's not appropriate to bring a newcomer like Morin to the autopsy. Do you need me to repeat it again? Heller didn't look up and still looked at the letter, picking up the feather pen placed on the table and making a tick on it. I understand. John stood up and waved to Morin, then Morin and John went out together. The body had been transported to the morgue in the basement, and John walked ahead without saying a word, making it difficult for Morin to speak. Two people walked silently to the basement, and a corpse covered in yellow linen was already placed on the stage. John walked up to the body, raised his hand to cover his mouth, coughed lightly, and then spoke up. Divine authority is prohibited here. The divine power of the precepts unfolded, and the invisible waves dispersed, enveloping the entire basement, including the corpse in front of it. Is it so safe? Of course, Morin understood what was going on. Before the autopsy, to prevent those with divine authority from plotting, he had to leave a backup first. John put on the mask that was placed aside and handed it to Morin on the side. Morin, let me tell you, you take note and write it clearly. Morin hurriedly took the mask and then picked up the notebook beside him. Nodding at John, indicating that he was ready. John took a deep breath, put on his gloves, and then uncovered the yellow burlap covering the body. There are dark red incantations on the surface of the body that do not understand their meaning, which is basically consistent with the previous cases. The skin of the deceased was densely covered with unknown spells, many of which were written in an airtight manner, and only a little bit of the original skin of the deceased could be seen. The deceased's eyes were removed, which was the technique of the 10,000 eyes cult. John opened the tightly closed eyes of the deceased, but there were no eyeballs inside, only a hollow darkness. The deceased's heart was dug out, following the style of the death cult. John's gaze shifted downwards, and there was a huge wound on the left chest of the deceased. The wound was densely serrated, as if it had been bitten open by some huge beast, terrifying and terrifying. The heart in the wound has long disappeared without a trace. John remained calm and reached into the wound, then began to grope downwards. John explored carefully and searched for the book garden www.zhaoshuyuan.com for a while before pulling out his hand. Most of the organs have been lost, and at least 5 underground sects have patronized them. These bastards, they started so quickly. John glanced at Morin, who was writing fiercely, and added a sentence. Don't take down the last half of the sentence just now. Then continue to search for the body. Finally, the deceased's left foot and right hand were lost, in the style of the Disabled Association. John covered the burlap back and then walked aside to start taking off his mask and gloves. These corpse collectors' movements are faster than ours, damn it. John threw the mask aside, shook his hair, and walked to the nearby sink to start washing his hands. Morin carefully recorded every word John said, and then pulled out a record sheet and stood behind John. It's the first time I've seen such a lifeless corpse. John pulled a piece of cloth from the nearby shelf, wiped his hands, and then hung the cloth back. How do you feel? John said to Morin and took the record sheet from Morin's hand. Morin just lowered his eyes and looked at the corpse. It's nothing, just a little emotional. John didn't say much when he saw the situation, just confirmed the report and asked Morin to leave. Before leaving, Morin stood at the door, looking back at the corpse lying on it, and tugged at the corner of his clothes with some discomfort. His name is George Belford. Yesterday, we entered the city together. That must have been kneeling at the door for a long time, right? He was brutally dismembered on the street that night, and his body was divided into this mess by underground sections. This is the royal capital, such a bustling tribute city. Chapter 9. Assign tasks. You are listening at novelfull.audio. John packed his things, quickly walked up the stairs, and entered the conference room. Morin scanned around, and Iris and the muscular man were gone. I don't know why the director sent them out. Deputy Director Michael and Miss Vanessa were still in their original positions, but Michael had already tilted his feet onto his desk, completely ignoring the anger that Miss Vanessa was about to vent behind him. Director, this is the autopsy report, which is similar to the previous deceased. John walked up to Director Heller, handed him the autopsy report, and then pulled out a chair to sit down. Morin obediently stood behind John and stood still. The dark red spell on the surface of the body has been visited by various underground sects, and nothing useful has been found. Is that right? Heller didn't seem surprised at all, so he picked up his quill and checked the previous letter, seeing that Morin was shrouded in mist. What is written on it? Why does the director seem particularly concerned about that thing? Morin tried to float a few glances, but still couldn't see what was written on it. Heller put down the letter in his hand and flipped it upside down on the table, eliminating any possibility of leakage. Michael, you and Vanessa can go to Green's grocery store for me, which is where Elvin Arnon used to work, and verify the information again. Green's grocery store. Morin silently noted down this place name. Although Uncle Air has been killed, he has already arrived at the capital and still needs to go and see. After all, it's my second uncle. Heller turned his head and gave orders to Michael, who was sitting on the board side. Okay, dear director. Received, we will definitely complete the task. With a frivolous tone and a solemn tone, Michael stood up from his position and walked out of the conference room with Vanessa. John, please take me back to the upper city and deliver this to the cathedral. Heller took out a letter from his pocket, which had already been sealed with fire paint. After the delivery, I'll give you a break so you don't have to come back in the afternoon. John, somewhat surprised, took the letter from Heller's hand and then opened his mouth to inquire. Is it not good for the director like this? Morin has just joined and there are some necessary onboarding procedures that I haven't worked on for him yet. Moreover, the case is so urgent now, so it's not good for me to go on vacation, is it? Heller raised his hand to stop John's question and pointed to the door, asking him to go get things done quickly. Don't worry about this, Morin will bring it to me today. I will take him out for business this afternoon, so you can rest well. Heller looked at John, who was still hesitant, with a hint of impatience in his tone. "Get out of here, are you making me angry? I'm kind enough to give you a break and keep grinding around here." John no longer hesitated, quickly picked up the letter on the table and walked out. Now only Heller and the bewildered Morin are left in the conference room. Heller remained silent, and Morin dared not speak either. He could only stay in the conference room with Heller and his two companions staring wide-eyed. Heller secretly picked up the inverted letter on the table, glanced at it quietly, and then cleared his throat. "Morin, come with me this afternoon to visit an old friend in Salati Alley." Heller stood up from the chair and beckoned Morin to follow him. "Come with me for lunch first. I'm starving to death. After finishing, let's go to the Salati district." Morin nodded and followed Heller with some restraint. "Go down the stairs to the first-floor lobby where ordinary police officers eat." "Really, these people, I just finished eating them all and ran away when I had a meeting." Heller shouted with some dissatisfaction, then vigorously patted the tightly closed window. "Where's the director's small stove? It's not possible to embezzle for you. Where's my small stove? I want to eat 2 servings." The tightly closed window opened a gap, and 2 things wrapped in paper were pushed out, and then the window closed tightly. Heller let out a proud groan twice, picked up those 2 things with satisfaction, and threw one to Morin. "Let's eat while walking, this is my favorite cheese sandwich." After speaking, I couldn't wait to open the paper bag and took a bite. Morin also took a tentative bite and immediately frowned, but still swallowed it. Although Morin hasn't tasted cheese for a long time, in his memory, at least cheese shouldn't be smelly. And paired with fresh tomatoes and pickled cucumbers, the whole taste is sour and unpleasant. Fortunately, 2 lettuce leaves neutralized each other, otherwise I would have to spit it out the first time I took it. "How about it? It's delicious." Morin followed Heller out of the police station and coldly heard Heller's question. It's okay, isn't it?" Morin was trying to swallow it in one gulp, but could only lift his head vaguely to show his affirmation. But when Morin looked up, he saw Heller froze and even forgot to keep up. Because Heller's eyes are red, not the familiar sea blue, but the kind of crimson. "Ma, she won't have to mess with herself again, will she? Based on my previous experience in the interrogation room, this is a precursor to divine power. Are I going to be taken to silence myself?" Morin struggled to swallow the last bite of the sandwich in his mouth, thinking with some fear. "What's up, why aren't you leaving?" Heller turned around, feeling a little confused as he looked at Morin's frightened expression. "Director, your eyes." Morin pointed to Heller and stood back in fear. "Ha! I'm sorry, I'm too excited." Heller blinked his eyes in confusion, only to realize it later. Heller widened his eyes towards Morin and blinked hard twice before the enchanting red slowly faded and turned back to its original sea blue color. "I'm sorry, I just advanced last month and I can't control myself." "Why are you so far away?" "I won't eat you." Heller felt a bit embarrassed and touched his head, but when he saw Morin standing so far, he immediately became angry again. Morin slowly walked up and breathed a sigh of relief after confirming that Heller wouldn't suddenly kill him. "Director, are you the god of discipline?" Morin followed Heller and asked the question he had always wanted to ask. "John is the divine authority of precepts, and his cousin Iris says it is the divine authority of shadows. Is there so many classifications of divine power before discipline? Just kidding, does Miss I look like those old antiques?" Heller turned around and stared at Morin with dissatisfaction, as if this sentence had offended Heller. "I am the god of evil desires, and Deputy Director Michael, like me, is also the god of evil desires." Heller seemed to be restless, and as he walked, he transformed into a bouncing pattern, bouncing around with each step. "Forget it, I'm in a good mood today. Let me give you some science popularization, and you don't have to worry about trying to trap me." Heller didn't even turn his head, as if he had guessed what Morin was going to do and interrupted him first. Morin, who was preparing to use cliché as, awkwardly smiled. Theocrats are just a general term for a large category, among which there are still quite a few classifications. Among them, the most common ones in Wandu are precepts, evil desires, and shadows. People with the power of precepts are rigid like an old man, while those with the power of evil desires are like me. With such sunshine and beauty, those with the power of shadows have a relatively low sense of existence. Beautiful sunshine. Which of these four words can be compared to the word evil desire? Morin tried to resist the desire to roast, and decided that Heller could only believe half of what he said. The word evil desire doesn't sound very good at first. The deity of discipline believes in the god of discipline, Anselperon, which is a church found everywhere in the country and can be considered the largest church in the country. Heller carried his hands behind his head and walked ahead, shaking his head from time to time. His long golden hair drifted back and forth. The power of evil desires. Although I don't want to admit it, most holders of the power of evil desires do have something on the table. Go to Shuyuan www.zhaoshuyuan.com. Heller shook his head somewhat dejected and complained loudly, ignoring the surprised gazes of passers-by. Why did I advance to this damn thing in the beginning? Those who desire divine power are suspected to have thick skin. Morin silently remembered this in his mind, and then heard Heller complain. The 10,000 Eyes Church, the Worshipping of the Dead Church, and the Disabled Association. These underground churches' top officials are basically the divine authorities of evil desires. When Morin heard this long string of underground cults, everyone became numb. Boy, isn't this bunch just mentioned by John during his autopsy? As for the shadow divine power, it's just a group of guys who can't stand the stage. Heller sneered and walked back to Lingu Avenue with Morin. The lower urban area is mainly divided into three areas. One is Lingu Avenue and its surrounding areas, one is the Koseg district where the Public Security Bureau is located, and the other is the destination of Morin and Heller's trip, the Selati district. Lingu Avenue is connected to Shangqing district through the Taijingji Bridge, so the surrounding area has the best public security. Koseg district has a security bureau set up here, so public security takes second place. And the Selati district is the most extreme opposite. All underground cults and gangs have established strongholds in the Selati district, where countless grey and black businesses are gathered. The king's city of Gondolin is the city of white flowers and a crown on the kingdom's territory. So the Selati district is the shadow on the crown that cannot be removed or wiped clean. Morin looked at Heller bouncing in front of him and couldn't help but doubt his future. But he still shook his head and followed Heller through Lingu Avenue, heading towards the Selati district. Chapter 10. Skirt Lane. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Morin cautiously leaned behind Heller and looked around cautiously. Despite Heller's repeated reminders, Morin still stubbornly leaned closer. Oh my, I'm so hot-tempered. Why are you so close to me? Heller couldn't bear it any more and pulled out the baton from his waist, pointing it at Morin and roaring angrily. The amplitude of the movement was so great that even the hat on the head tilted to one side. Oh my, Director Heller, aren't I worried about my own life safety? Morin coaxed Heller well and angrily, while casually straightening Heller's hat. This is the Selati district, I'm afraid I might accidentally say goodbye to the director. Heller looked at the pitiful Morin in front of him, his tone relaxed. Forget it, we're right ahead. Did you see those two fools in front? Heller put down the baton in his hand, his tone softened a lot, and pointed to the two guys leaning against the entrance of the alley in front of him. Morin stopped and squinted his eyes to look at the entrance of the alley ahead. There are two young people standing at the entrance of the alley, looking slightly older than Morin. They are leaning against the wall, exchanging ideas and occasionally emitting wild laughter. I can still vaguely hear some indecent vocabulary. It must be such a boring afternoon, only by making some jokes like this can I pass the time. What's wrong, Director? Morin raised one hand on his forehead and looked at the two people from a distance, while asking Heller a question. Suddenly, something hard pressed against Morin's chest. "Go, take this thing and beat them both up." Morin lowered his head and saw Heller's hard baton pressing against his chest. "Director. Isn't that good? I'm a good citizen." Morin hesitated to consider whether to take the baton, and then met Heller's eyes, which had turned red at some point. "You have two choices. First, take my baton and go beat those two people up." Heller's expression became indifferent, his crimson eyes fixed on Morin with a chilling killing intent. "Secondly, I'll beat you up first, and then I'll go beat those two people over there." Looking at the cold Heller in front of him, Morin swallowed his saliva, suppressed the discomfort, took Heller's baton, and crossed his crimson eyes. Under Heller's expressionless gaze, he slowly walked up. However, Morin's timid appearance did not resemble that of a person who would pick a fight. He was afraid of his hands and feet, hiding the stick in his arms and looking around like a thief who had stolen money. Morin and Heller were not far from the entrance of the alley, and Morin's appearance quickly caught the attention of those two people. But the two of them seemed to ignore Heller, who was wearing a police uniform behind them, and rushed towards Morin. "Hey, what's the kid doing? What about you, are you deaf?" But Morin didn't seem to hear it and just walked forward with the stick in his arms. "I can't hear you, can I?" Perhaps Morin's appearance was too eye-catching, wearing worn-out clothes and shrinking his head, he didn't look like a good person no matter what. A person had already rushed forward first, without any unnecessary words, and directly punched Morin's face with a left hook. Morin was hit and lay flat on the ground, feeling dizzy. He wanted to get up, but his head was groggy and unable to get up. "Humph, anyone dares to come and cause trouble, really." Another person walked up and grabbed Morin's collar, lifting him up. But this action also exposed the baton that had been hidden in my arms. "Yo, I picked up a stick to find fault, didn't I?" These two people seemed to selectively ignore Heller, who was still wearing a uniform not far away, and slapped Morin's face again. This completely blinded Morin, and his head drooped weakly. "It's still standard, hand it over to me." The person wanted to reach out and snatch the baton from Morin's arms. Hailey, who was not far away, shook his head and prepared to step forward. After all, he was also one of his subordinates, and it was hard to justify being beaten and robbed here. "Hey, you damn kid, I gave you face, didn't I?" Heller stopped and continued to stand in place, watching with great interest. Her intuition told her that there was a good scene to watch. One person reached out to grab the baton in Morin's arms, but Morin's right hand was so strong that it was terrifying, and he tightly grabbed the baton in his hand. A person was about to extend their hand and slap Morin again, but Morin raised his head. With a fist print and a palm print on his face, he looked somewhat pitiful, but a crazy smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Laugh, make you laugh at me." A person looked at Morin's slightly crazy smile, raised their right hand and waved it down, ready to slap Morin hard again. Morin struck like lightning, grabbing his right hand in the air with his left hand. Before he could react, the baton in his right hand had already left his embrace. "Raise high." "Ah!" A crisp sound and screams appeared simultaneously, and the person lay down in pain, holding onto their right hand and howling in pain. The solid oak stick slammed heavily onto the right wrist. "You!" Before the person holding onto Morin's collar could react, their companion lay on the ground in agony. Subconsciously, the left hand loosened Morin's collar. But Morin's ferocious smile is already within reach. Morin supported the ground with one hand, stood up with force, and raised his baton high again, rushing down his face at lightning speed. "Ah!" There was another wail, and another person lay on the ground. Heller hugged his chest with both hands and leaned against the nearby wall, witnessing the entire process. "Not bad, you fought back after being beaten, instead of lying on the ground crying and crying." Heller nodded in satisfaction and quietly took out the letter from his pocket, using his nails to redraw it. Ah! With another howl of sorrow, Morin walked up to the person who had been hit in the right hand, and the baton was raised again, fiercely thrusting down his thigh. It seemed like it wasn't enough, so I came to the person next to me in the same position again. Hey, what are you doing? You too, stop quickly. At this moment, the people in the alley heard continuous wails and rushed out of the alley towards the Morin couple. A large group of people rushed over with knives and sticks, shouting for Morin to stop. But Morin remained unmoved, just lowering his head and ignoring it, throwing a stick down. Hey, you want to die? Stop it now. The leader's words were swallowed back because there was still a person standing between them and Morin. It's Heller. Heller stood in front of Morin, and she stood in front of Morin. Behind him was Morin, with his head lowered, and in front of him was a group of extremely vicious villains. The identity of the director of the Public Security Bureau in the following urban areas. Heller tilted his head and looked at the villain ahead with crimson eyes, without any fear. The military knife on the crossbody had already been unsheathed, and Heller held it flat with one hand on his waist, pointing at the villains ahead. Come on, try moving forward one more step. Heller's lazy tone seemed to have no deterrent power, but the large group of people in front of him suddenly stopped and dared not say a word. Are you trying to confront the Security Bureau? Within this city of Gondolin. Hailey raised his knife and slowly moved forward step by step. She took a step forward and the person across from her took a step back. I brought someone here to investigate the case, and my team member was attacked for no reason. He is currently conducting a reasonable counterattack. What are you doing when you rush out with weapons? What do you want to do? Although Morin is not wearing a uniform and he only joined the position today, Heller said Morin is, so he is. Because her name is Heller, Heller Silva. He is the director of the Public Security Bureau in the lower urban area. Heller shouted loudly at the group of people across from him, forcing them step by step back into the alley. Although she is only one person, despite her small stature, it seems like there are thousands of troops and horses behind her, and she is steadily moving forward step by step. Now, put down your weapons and make way. Heller still held his military knife, tilted his head slightly, and the police hat on his head also tilted off, but it did not affect Heller's dignity at this moment. Heller repeated loudly again. Put down your weapons, make way, otherwise. Heller didn't say anything later, but everyone present knew what it was. The knives and sticks of the Public Security Bureau, the spears and hooves of the city guard, and the people in the upper city district. If there is a suspected rebellion in the city, the people in the upper city district will never mind sending a team of theocratic knights down for a walk. There were no screams behind him anymore, and Morin walked silently behind Heller, just keeping his head down, not knowing what he was thinking, with the baton hidden in his arms like a thief. Put down your weapon. The leader shouted with extreme unwillingness, while throwing the knife in his hand onto the ground. Boss. The person beside him seemed unwilling to say something, but he was slapped in the face. Pop. The crisp voice could not conceal the speaker's anger, as he looked angrily at Heller and Morin behind her. I said put down your weapons for me. The leader repeated it again as if venting their anger, and then stood on the side of the alley as if accepting their fate. The subordinates also followed suit and threw all their weapons onto the ground, then made way for a road leading to the skirt lane. Humph. Hailey no longer raised his knife upon seeing this, withdrew it into its sheath, waved and signaled for Morin to follow. Under the fierce gaze of a large group of armed militants, the two of them entered the skirt lane like this.